Good morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning. Welcome along. You have found the Tech and Innovation stage. Well done. It is where we are going to be over the next 2 days at Leaders Week for fresh ideas, practical, actionable tips and best practice in data management, fan engagement, venue solutions, digital content, and a whole lot more besides. We will be joined over the next couple of days by executives from the NFL, from Williams F1, Wimbledon, Snapchat, Paddy Power, plus Recast, Unity, MarketCast, the Professional Fighters League, CSM Live, InFrontX, Musco, and PumpJack DataWorks. It's really great to have so many of you with us in the room, actually here in person. Hello to those of you who can't be with us in the room as well, but are watching this streaming live or indeed on demand at Leaders Week Direct on the platform there. Over the next couple of days, throughout all the sessions, I will be your guide. My name's David Cushnan, Head of Content at Leaders, but we want this room to be as interactive as possible. We encourage your questions, and the way to do that in this exciting, complex new world in which we live is through something called a mobile phone. I don't know if any of you have got one of those, but they're really quite good. And if you download the official Leaders app, and click on Speaker Interaction, you will be able to ask a question at any time and we'll feed it into any of the conversations as we go through the day. It's time for our first session, and it's fitting perhaps that we begin with content, and in particular how broadcasters and athletes are being empowered and encouraged to engage fans more frequently and more effectively. This session has been put together with the help of Greenfly, the leader in digital media monetization. The Greenfly software platform empowers organizations to collect, organize, and distribute digital media to partners and advocates to build awareness on social media, increase loyalty, and drive revenue growth. And we're going to hear a lot more about that now over the next half an hour or so with our two guests. So please welcome to the stage Formula One's Editor-in-Chief for Social and Digital, Sam Tremayne, and the President and CEO of Greenfly, Daniel Kirschner. Grab a seat, gentlemen. Very good to have you with us. There is no mute button today. I should just remind you of that, so be on your guard. And we're looking forward to a really interesting discussion here. And Daniel, I'd love you to set the scene for us, if you would. Assess the industry and where we're at in terms of content and the way it's being amplified and perhaps the way it should be amplified.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in a period of just a lot of opportunity. I think, as we all know, there's tremendous amount of activity and engagement on social media. And for rights holders and broadcasters, that's sometimes viewed as a form of competition, but it also is driving tremendous energy and excitement and attention around the core offering. And so I think we're in a period, and this is really what we're focused on at Greenfly, where there's an opportunity to really think about how can the broadcasters, how can the rights holders really harness this energy, channel this energy, and really have a role in really directing and leveraging it in a way that really drives the value of the rights holders themselves and the value of the broadcast.
Good stuff. We're going to talk about athletes and broadcasters as two particular stakeholder groups that need servicing and that you're partnering with. What are some of the key differences between those two in terms of what they are asking of you, what they're asking of rights holders, and how they need to be serviced from a content point of view?
That's a very interesting question. I think that for athletes, I think have come to really appreciate the value that they have on social media channels and their ability to really connect with fans in a very direct and intimate way. And I think for athletes, they're looking at tools and resources to really build those relationships and grow those relationships. From the rights holder perspective, I think ultimately the rights holder wants to grow the value of their core offerings and really understands those athletes as partners and advocates and ambassadors that really can bring those messages out to a much broader audience. And for broadcasters, I think they're looking for compelling content. They want to deliver an incredible experience on the core offering, but they also realize that these other channels and these other forms of content have a lot of value in driving tune-in, and driving excitement, and sustaining excitement and engagement between events. And so they're looking for forms of content that sit outside of the traditional broadcast that they can really leverage on social media and other channels. And they're also looking to the rights holders and to the athletes to help them in building excitement and sustaining excitement and in driving engagement around the core offering and the broadcast themselves.
Sam, it's great to have you with us, and particularly so given we were really keen, obviously, to have somebody from Formula One with us at Leaders Week this year, and we've been eyeing up the calendar and how it's been chopping and changing over the past few weeks, and we've managed to find a gap so neatly in between Russia and Turkey to pin you down. So it's great to have you here. Talk a little bit, if you would, about the way that and your role is social and digital content, essentially. Tell us a little bit about the way that Formula One's digital and social approach has evolved, because I think all of us in this room can agree it's been a fairly explosive period of growth over the past few years as you've rolled a lot of new things out.
Yeah, I mean, I know I've bored you with this story, but I had the pleasure of being here 7 years ago at the start of it under Bernie Ecclestone. So I've kind of been able to map the journey from where we were back then to where we are now. I think it's iterative, like there is never a fixed point on it. And I think to the point around where Greenfly comes in and where the fan engagement piece comes in is that I think for us, 6 years ago, it was very much about we need to build awareness. That was a point where we didn't operate on any platform. We didn't have a digital team. We didn't have a digital presence. We didn't have a digital focus, approach, mindset, any of that. So I think for several years, it was about building our own systems, capability, understanding, workflows. And that was effectively our low-hanging fruit. That was where we could win in terms of there was a lot of unexplored, untapped potential. I think as we've got further down that journey, as we've built a bit of the scale that we were wanting to and that we've kind of identified we were behind on, it's about pivoting into more of an association play and giving people a reason to connect, a reason to tune in. And that's where it also becomes about, well, what are your best levers for doing that? Obviously, we own our own content and we can drive that on our own channels, but it's also about saying, what's the wider ecosystem? How do you wrap drivers into that? How do you wrap teams into that? No matter how well we do, and hopefully we do a fairly good job, we're never going to be able to speak in the same way that a driver can around certain content, around certain issues, around certain themes, and it's never going to resonate in the same way because we are a brand first. We try and position ourselves really as a fan. That's our kind of persona, our tone of voice. But we're never going to be able to replicate and match the authenticity of a driver. So it's then about serving. At some point, the pivot comes into your lower hanging fruit. One of the levers is how you serve teams and how you serve drivers with more content.
And that is something that has evolved in the past few years, and as a consumer of a lot of that stuff. Take us into the process then. Lewis Hamilton drives another pole lap, and then that lap, the onboard of that lap, appears on Mercedes channels and then Lewis's own channels. What's the process internally to make that happen?
I mean, ultimately, initially at least, it's a fairly budget process. There isn't a great deal of science behind that or magic behind that. That is about good comms with teams and drivers from the outset, establishing way back in 2015, but having that as a regular cadence, what we are trying to do, how we position ourselves so that A, that's not a surprise when it's coming down, B, it's not a surprise in terms of how it's positioned, C, it fits within a wider balance. So you're never going to win if you only do good or only do bad in terms of like, we try and take an editorial first approach to every content that we serve. So it's about establishing that they are going to get points that they are more willing to engage in, that are positive for them, and there are going to be points where we are talking about them in a way that they might not like, but that is how we are positioning. So I think first and foremost it's about the comms and the open sharing of approach and aspirations and goals and setup and vision for our side. And then it's about, well, how do you actually get that content to them directly, and what is that content? What do they want to engage with? And what can we supply them in terms of rights, in terms of the retrieval times in terms of how it fits within our wider structure. You know, I won't go into the reads of detail, but what we give often has to fit within what we use ourselves. So there has to be a balance between curating for our own side and curating for them, and that also has to be communicated back so that they're not seeing driver A get something one day, driver B not get something, and B questions about, well, that's favourable treatment, etc.
Have you got a big wall chart at home, sort of ticking off who's got what when?
Google Doc, and it's as complicated as that. Yeah.
It's always a Google Doc. The other, not necessarily unique element with Formula One, but there's not many sports where this happens. Is within any individual race, you have obviously 20 cars, and therefore 20 quite individual at times stories, and obviously within that, each car might have multiple battles going on during a race, and so there's endless layers to a race. The live broadcast can pick out many of those, but there's so much more that you then have access to on boards, team radio that you can play in afterwards. Tell us a little bit about what you do. Is it just sort of working out what you've got Monday morning after a race and sort of figuring out what's interesting and additive, is that the word? For the viewer who might have watched the race, as well as people who may not have watched the race but might find stuff interesting.
Yeah, 100%. And we were talking about that earlier, right? One of the USPs that F1 have, we don't have the 100 games of content per calendar season. We have 22 going to 23, too many already. Races, we don't have that same volume of content. What we do have is within that race, 20 drivers, all with 4 onboard cameras, all with radio systems, and a world feed that can only show, and 25 trackside cameras at every event, and a world feed that can only show 1, maybe 2 if you use picture-in-picture, parts of that at any one time. And I've always kind of called that the F1, I think, has a really unique iceberg effect in terms of the world feed can only actually provide so much. And the role of digital, therefore, we have a really good gap to look at. And we kind of, when we started on this, we knew there was some potential in that. I think we've found and discovered that it's kind of grown more and more as we've gone down the years. But that's one of the key parts of, we're the 3rd biggest in terms of overall fan engagements across the globe of all major rights holders, behind Champions League and NBA, I think. And that's largely underpinned by our audience functions it's a hyper sticky audience that consumes an incredible amount per user. And a lot of that is because we're bringing in exclusive content. There's things that won't have been seen, that won't have been shown on the world feed. There might have been a view of it, but actually there's several other angles that have never been exposed. And that's where digital can play really well for Formula One, because you can expose that. And then there's obviously platform considerations about where do you position that, how does that fall within F1 TV, which has been really good at an additional exposure. How do you actually surface them? And we still do a lot of crowdsourcing, to be honest. There is still a large part of our content is fed by seeing fans pick it up because they are watching a driver X, and we just don't have the eyeballs to do the same. But again, that's where the Greenfly plays so well, because then you're looking at, well, how do you expose that? What's the right basis for doing that? How do you start wrapping in broadcasters or teams or drivers? And if we are uniquely set up, like part of the big effort over the last 4 years has been to build a high volume, high capability post-production team, which isn't how teams are set up, isn't how broadcasters are set up. So how do we drop them into giving access to those capabilities within Formula One? And effectively it's within your pocket on a mobile phone app. But yeah, that's one of the USPs that we have found, and we think we win versus other sports, is that there's just that depth of complexity that the world feed can never fully show. I keep saying world feed, that's a kind of F1 term, but what you see on TV.
Yeah. A prime example of that, for anybody who hasn't seen it, from the Russian Grand Prix a week or so ago, is I think it's about an 8-minute video, and it's not a particularly edited video. It's the kind of the raw onboard footage of Max Verstappen's final 5 laps of the race. It's starting to rain, they're making decisions about tyres, they're trying to work out where they are in the race, and it's essentially the onboard of him with his engineer, and it's an incredible, for people who watch the race, it's a sort of a real bonus to understand what was going on between one driver and one engineer, but actually it's a masterclass in communication as well, so it's really worth picking out. I think that's on YouTube, I believe.
Yeah, go and watch it.
Go and watch it, but not now, because we've got to continue chatting, and we're going to bring Daniel back in now. And from a Greenfly perspective, tell us a little bit about how you're measuring success in the way that you're working with rights holders or athletes or broadcasters or all of them together. What are the key things that you are measuring and looking out for, and that gives you a good indication that things are working?
So we're really, so Greenfly really is a core infrastructure solution. So we're not, getting into the business that the organization is doing in terms of what they're putting on Greenfly and how they're moving it. But what we really look at is what Greenfly enables the organization to do is connect all these different pieces together. So to connect the organization, the rights holder with the athletes, and their teams, and of course you have these very sophisticated teams in Formula One, with the broadcasters, potentially with other sponsors and partners. All these people are connected in this ecosystem where content can be easily captured and moved and be made available in real time, or looking at the rights issues, be made available when it's appropriate. So when we really look at kind of the health and the impact of the ecosystem, we're looking a lot at how much content is moving. Like one of the things that's really interesting that we're talking about here, Formula One is in a unique position maybe in terms of how much content they're generating in real time in the events, but that is true with the technology and sophistication and cameras and everything from people running around on the sidelines with mobile devices to all the different cameras in an event. There's a lot of content being generated. So really what we're looking at is making sure that content is coming to our system in an organized way, and then is being made available and being used. So we're really looking at how much content is moving, and for like a large sports organization like Major League Baseball, that might be in the millions of pieces of content over the course of a season. And then we're looking at how much content's being used, what percentage of that content's being used, how much is being deployed. And so when you think about like the Formula One as an example, you have all these audio feeds, you have all the cameras on the cars, you have all the cameras in the venue, you have all the stuff around the actual people attending the events, and all that content that's being captured.
Got a camera on the champagne bottle.
Yeah.
Camera on the champagne bottle.
Off.
You have all this stuff that's being generated. The question is, are we able to really connect into that ecosystem and make that content not just usable, but make sure each content sort of reaches its highest purpose? So content that might not make the cut for what you call the world feed or the actual feed on the broadcast is incredibly valuable for one of the athletes, and if they share it, it's going to have an enormous impact. It might be popular in a particular country or region or places where there are relationships. And so the key is to look at this incredible ecosystem and make sure that content is really being delivered, accessible in real time, and used and deployed. And then we can go the next step when we look at social media in terms of how it's performing. Is it connecting? What are the engagement metrics on it? How do those look? And you can also apply various evaluation algorithms to look at the impact of that content and how much it's worth in some sense. Those are all things that we look at. But I think at the most fundamental thing, we're saying how much content is moving, how much of it is being used, and are all these different pieces connected together in a meaningful way.
Over the past 3-4 years, longer, we've seen new social media platforms come to prominence. Within those social platforms, all sorts of different features, some of which very similar to other features, be launched.
Inspired by.
I know
the Snapchat folks are here. So.
Yeah. What's the challenge when a new feature or even social platform emerges? And how do you work with your rights holder partners to ensure that you're helping maximize that and optimize that?
So it's very interesting because I think people always think it's like the end of history, right? So they thought, oh, it's all Facebook, and oh, it's all Instagram, right?
Not this week.
Not this week. No, but I mean, obviously, Snapchat has never been more relevant. TikTok is, the growth metrics look unlike what Instagram was able to achieve. So there's obviously this is a very fast-moving and evolving ecosystem. I think what's special about what we do is that we're infrastructure that sits sort of adjacent or behind or connected to this ecosystem. And so you're moving content around our system, but we're completely agnostic as to where that content is going. So something new comes up, and all of a sudden, a lot of content's going there. And over time, we've seen a lot more content going to TikTok, for example, over the past year, not surprisingly. Instagram stories were, kind of like a niche, and now they're probably the primary destination of content on our platform is potentially Instagram stories. In certain regions, other channels will be relevant. So I think, our goal is to really connect this ecosystem and enable content to move, and where that content goes is going to depend on what's the most relevant thing at a given time. And I'm sure for Formula One that's evolving, and you're looking at these things as they emerge, and maybe you're focused on a region, and that has different impact in terms of what platforms. The other thing is that the kind of content that we can move, varies. So obviously with the rise of stories generally, vertical video became really prominent. That remains true with Snapchat, and that's another thing that I think there's been an increasing focus on sort of capturing and moving that kind of content. But for us, we want to make it really easy to get to any platform. You can, we have direct integrations to share directly to certain platforms, but you can always download and use another platform, so people can share stuff on stuff we've never heard of. And people put stuff into WhatsApp, implement an influential WhatsApp group, not all going out to public social channels. You might be going to private Facebook groups or other places that have a lot of impact. So I think the kind of fluidity of the platforms has actually been something that's been really beneficial to us, because we're providing a way to operate outside of it.
There's a bit of a reverse engineering to that as well, I think, in that we have the fortune of being able to structure, this is the budget that we have, these are the goals that we have, this is where we want to operate. I think if you're, we are lucky as a rights holder to be able to do that in quite a removed manner. I think if you're part of a smaller setup, especially on a driver or athlete team, and it wasn't long ago that Formula One just didn't have that kind of aspect to it at all. Part of the question as to how are you going to convey your own brand, I hate that word, but it's probably the best way of putting it, is, well, what's the content look like? And actually, if you've got a means of serving that content from the start, you can then kind of work backwards a bit more easily as to, okay, well, I'm confident that, this is what it would look like, rather than, I don't know what my message should be, I don't know what assets I have, etc. There's a bit of a sort of reverse engineer that actually it facilitates opening up X, Y, and Z as well.
If you've got a question for Sam or Daniel, as mentioned, either download the Leaders app, or there's a secondary way you can ask a question, which is via something called a browser. Who knew? Slido.com, and then the code you need is #leaders to ask a question. So if you'd like to fire one in, they will come to this, which is called an iPad. All sorts of new technology available for us today as we're back in person. F1 apart, sorry Sam, who are the rights holders who you are looking at, who you're thinking are doing this really well and are sort of either inspiring you or giving you pause for thought?
I think our original contact into this way of thinking was with Bundesliga a couple of years back. And I think part of that is that there's a great example of David De Gea saved a penalty, and I can't remember who it was against. Oh, West Ham. And it was a very dramatic 93rd minute harsh penalty after not. Anyway, I'm not even a United fan, but I'm getting defensive. I think his ability to use that photo, and there's a great one that he put in, is it's from behind the goal. It's a really good example of giving an athlete an asset or content material that is authentic to them, but the way that they are able to relay that, portray that, and use it is very, very different to how a club would be able to do it. And I think that's a really good example of the power of that authentic connection and association. I guess that's kind of what I said earlier, that we kind of moved from awareness to association. And it's empowering that side of things. I think it was his first penalty save of his professional career. Probably done him a real bad disservice, but I don't think he's got a very good record. So it resonated on that sense too. It was the win for Man United, but it was importantly giving him the voice and the ability to talk about it on his own terms. And I think that's the key for what you're looking for and driving for in that. And I think that's why it kind of that will always have a power and a resonance and a reach beyond the Premier League or the clubs doing it themselves. I think that's the kind of the key that you're looking for in this, is that you give them the tools to do it alongside. And like we said earlier, if you do that right, it's not competitive or cannibalistic with your broadcasters. You know, it's mutually beneficial, and it's driving whether directly on tuning or more pertinently long-term association and connection. That's the kind of goals that you're looking for with it, I think.
Just on that, is that something that you're having to constantly manage, or at least be aware of, that balance, to make sure things are not tilted too much in favour of content that you're making available to teams and drivers in your case versus broadcasters who in some cases, and I know F1's doing a lot of its own, you know, F1 TV digital stuff, but there are some broadcasters that have retained digital rights. You know, is that just a constant monitoring process to make sure things don't get out of kilter one way or the other? Yeah,
100%. And that again is at any point in time, rights holders, clubs will have to work out how they structure the prioritisation between broadcasters, sponsors, teams, drivers, I should say athletes, and their own channels and their own output. And I think for us that looked very different 4 years ago when we didn't have the scale of the presence to what it does now. You know, it was very much about communicating a long-term strategy that's going to be beneficial for everyone 3 years, 4 years down the line. I think we're at that point now, and that kind of necessitates a bit of a reset as to, well, how are we embracing that? And part of that, like I say, was we are discovering. I'd love to say 6 years ago we had a very clear picture of exactly where we'd end up. That's obviously not true. A lot of it is voyage of discovery. But in doing that, you build out the team, the expertise, and there's a lot of people that are way better than me at Formula One that kind of underpin all of it, of how you build out your post-production efforts, your editorial aspect, your clip curation, etc. Once you've got those in place, you know, we've now got one of the best editorial teams around. Then you can say, well, how are we serving broadcasters with that? You know, there are certain broadcasters that actively want all of our content. How are we delivering that to them? That's where Greenfly comes in. How do we do that in a way that is beneficial to us, e.g. they are not taking it before we take it, like we retain control over when that goes out. There is a coordinated plan of, okay, they can reach deeper into territory X, therefore it's actually beneficial to us too, but we are positioning ourselves as collaborative with them and mutually beneficial with them, versus a 5 years ago picture that, you know, this was taking away eyeballs from the live product. And I think that's the kind of pivot that we're going through now, but that is if not daily, you know, that is a regular reset as to how you structure that prioritization.
And just to follow on from that, having done all that work over the past 6 years, do you now have a clearer view and sense of the next 6 years? Or is it still, are you still very much on that voyage of discovery?
I think we probably have a clearer picture. Maybe there's a bit of expertise that we've learnt along the way. I think also we have more of a sense of where the low-hanging fruit is and how much of it is left. I think it was very clear that there was a lot 6 years ago, and a lot of our efforts have been about saying, okay, this makes most sense on this basis. I feel like I've said this a lot, but it comes back to Greenfly in terms of what the right levers for the right time are. So at the moment now, there isn't a mad amount of extra scale we can inject into the cadence of content. And that is, by the way, more on certain rights structures than it is about, you know, in an ideal world, we publish 40 hours of content a week and it'd be an easy life apart from the people having to churn it out. But the right levers then become, well, how do you, without materially adjusting your resource and your headcount, etc., how do you start seeding that to a wider audience then? How does that content reach further? And that's about, well, how do you distribute it to partners and to media partners? How do you turn a driver into a media partner? I hate the word brand advocate. I know that's kind of used, but it feels a bit mercenary, but it's about turning them into part of your distribution plan.
I put the call out for questions. You have delivered. Thank you very much. So I'm going to ask Daniel the first one here. which is from Anthony at Hill and Knowlton Strategies. Thanks, Anthony. Can you give a recent example of a rights holder's commercial partner who has benefited from Greenfly, and how was the benefit evaluated?
Yeah, it's a good, lots of examples I'm trying to think about. On the commercial partner front, I know one thing that's very interesting, we talk about the athlete distribution. That's become an enormous driver of sponsorship value, because it really exponentially increases the amount of content and the level of engagement, and in general, the cumulative impact and reach of the athletes greatly exceeds that of the rights holder. So I can think of one, and I won't call it out in particular, but one of the top football clubs in Europe, which told us that when they were negotiating around jersey sponsorship, they put Greenfly front and center, because they were able to make the argument that we're not just going to be able to deliver this content consistently, reliably, and measurably on our own channels, but we're also going to deliver it on our on the channels of our athletes. And I know that sponsor called that out in particular as a major driver of value for them, and I guess that was probably measured in the size of the ultimate deal, if you wanted to measure it. But that's one way of looking at it. I mean, looking at it from the broadcaster, I'm thinking about like athletes and broadcasters, both those themes here. I know we've seen the broadcasters place tremendous value on these alternative forms of content, because they realize that it really supports the broadcast, and they want to really be part of that conversation and be able to feature it. And so, Sam called out a Bundesliga. They've really been tremendous pioneers in using our platform to support their broadcasters and deliver a lot of value to them. And I know that that's something that's really been, that's had a big impact on being able to drive attention, viewership, excitement, engagement, and sustaining, both lead in and sustaining that level of excitement through the events themselves.
And they wrap in with teams to broadcasters, right? So like teams will, as I understand it, teams will shoot content in a dressing room that broadcasters then can then use, not quite live, but on a, if you're 90 minutes before a game, you can get that. Like, it's a really mutually beneficial cycle, I think. It's a really good model, I think.
Yeah.
Another question here from Philip Sharp, who is sitting there on the front row. Nice to see you, Philip, star of our Leaders Live online shows. And Philip from InfrontX, who asks you, Sam, how does F1 determine the value created by your relationship with Greenfly, and how do you measure it?
Great question. There's a couple of ways that there's a couple of folks in the room that will actually be better placed to answer. Adam at the back would be a better one as well. There's a couple of paths that we've taken over the last few years, and I think it's a kind of open as to exactly how you want to do that as a business. Like, is it that example where there's a incremental benefit in sponsorship and you either try and pinpoint that down, or you sort of have it's a 5%, 10% element of that, and you track that. Is there a way that you say, well, actually, the exposure value is equal to X, and there are a couple of companies that we speak to about being able to parlay that into, if you know that you were in this market at this time, that would have had an ad buy of Y, so that's your kind of value. I think we're kind of on a moving basis with that as to what's right, and I think part of that is also relaying that to where that matters. So who's setting that? Is that sponsorship setting that because they want to be able to take that to sponsors and wrap that into the deals that they're doing? Is that then called out and therefore something that we would strive towards actively ourselves? I kind of have a bit of a lucky remit in that doesn't have to be my primary concern, but 100% that it has to be part of the wider picture as to why we're doing it and where the justification and rationale are. So it's about tracking that within an agreed set of parameters. I think, like I say, we've kind of changed as to exactly what those are over the years. But it's about setting out, first and foremost, how you track it and making sure that you're aware of exactly what the numbers are, and then saying, well, what does that mean, or what's the value? I feel like I've kind of skirted around because I don't think we've got an exact science to it. I don't think we've got an exact, like, this is 100% decisively the right way of doing it. But we kind of go down the path Dan highlighted.
I would describe it as some expert skirting.
Thank you very much.
If you didn't call it out, I don't think anybody would have noticed.
Couple of quick fire ones, again, probably for you, Sam. From George Wright, did you have to renegotiate content deals with broadcasters to be able to give content to drives and teams?
I did not personally. Yes. I don't want to speak out of my pay grade and when it's other people doing it.
But there's
there is a conversation 100% with broadcasters, and like I say, it's the same with teams and drivers. And that really came in under the Liberty era. It wasn't as present under the Bernie Ecclestone era, and at that point we worked on a holdback of 365 days maximum, but like a calendar year. So yeah, there's definitely a conversation to be had in terms of resetting how we operate.
And Wayne Davidson from Little Dot Studios asks about archive content. Obviously, a lot of leagues, federations have found success in growing brand awareness by making archive content more readily available, especially to teams and clubs. What's the F1 take on that?
I think when we first started, it was. I mean, it's always an ever-present, and it's actually a very strong part of a lot of fan connection. I think we have tried to move away from it more as a major fundamental cornerstone of our output. And I think part of that is that as we've relaxed rights, as we've got progress with teams, broadcasters, and athletes, and as we've increased our own post-production, there is more depth potentially to current season in terms of connection, and we want to make sure that we are constantly relevant and pushing. And I don't know what time we're on, so I don't want to bring it in late, but the Drive to Survive, I think, is a good example, which we were talking about earlier about, if you look at your Michael Jordan documentary, as amazing as it is, it's removed by 10, 20 years from the action. And I think that's where Drive to Survive is so powerful, because it's talking about people that you can then go and engage with and watch. And I think we've kind of pivoted the importance away a little bit from archive. It still plays a big part of our output, don't get me wrong, but I think ideally we are more and more looking at current season, current drivers, current action.
Paul Jenkins asks an interesting question from Triple Double about, obviously F1 is equipping through Greenfly drivers, teams with content. Are ideas coming back the other way in terms of what drivers and teams would like you to produce, or is that something again where the relationship over time can become a lot more collaborative potentially? Yeah,
I would definitely go the latter, and for full candor, like, we're quite early in our journey with Greenfly. I've said journey as well, and I hate saying that. But we are not at that stage where it is we are fully fledged and there is that feedback loop. That is 100% part of the rationale for doing this, is that is part of the process, that if you do it right, it should be collaborative. They can come and ask for X, Y, or Z delivered. And again, we don't have eyes over everything that happens. We don't have a knowledge and context of every single bit that comes across. And we also don't know what resonates best with the drivers or teams themselves. So being able to cater to that is only going to be a good thing for us and them. So that's 100% part of the long-term picture for it, yeah.
We've got 1 minute left. Daniel, I want to ask you about the commercial opportunity here as it stands. We've touched on it, but what does that commercial opportunity, or what could that commercial opportunity look like in the future, do you think?
Commercial opportunity for the rights holder? Or
yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things that we're seeing a lot more of is using this ecosystem to serve sponsors directly, to provide them with access to curated feeds of content that they can deploy, and potentially even to connect them with athletes in certain circumstances as well. So I think that's an area that we're seeing just a lot more energy and activity, and I think that's really interesting as we support the kind of broader ecosystem. Just kind of hopping back to what Sam was talking about as well, we're really working on a lot more insights through the platform in terms of what content people are choosing to use and how that's performing, and getting a lot more information about how different content on different distribution points, how different content has different impact, and how to really optimize that.
Well, look, it's been fantastic chatting. Sam, thank you so much for joining us. I know you've got a busy few weeks ahead, so good luck with it all. We'll be watching on various platforms.
Thanks very much.
Daniel, we're so pleased you were able to fly over and join us in London, and talk to us all today. Our next session on this stage starts in about 20 minutes' time. Actually, very much following on from what we've been talking about, and we're going to be delving a bit more into the monetization of content, specifically with Snapchat and Wimbledon and Live-like. So do be back in about 20 minutes' time. But for now, Sam Tremayne, Daniel Kirschner, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.